Thank you so much, Rachel. We're really pleased to be here. And if you were on here earlier, you heard us say that we've never done this before. So this is a new experience for us, and we're excited to do this together. So as Rachel said, my name is Leyla King. I am a Palestinian American clergywoman, a priest in the Episcopal Church. I think I'm right in saying that I am the only Palestinian American clergy woman in the Episcopal Church. I know there are a couple of men, but I think I'm the only clergy woman. Though if anyone can prove me wrong on that, I would love to know that. So please let me know. I am not, however, the only Palestinian American in the Episcopal Church. There are a number of them. Many of them are related to me, but not all of them. So please know that we exist here in the Episcopal Church. And so Rachel invited me here to tell a little bit about my story, my family story, my ancestry, and how I come to be here as an ordained Episcopal priest. But in order to do that, you need to have a little bit of history. You need to have that story contextualized by the historical facts. And lucky for me and lucky for you, I happen to be married to a preeminent church historian who can do that work for us. So I'm also aware that I actually, all I can see right now is ourselves, which is a little bit odd. So I don't actually know who's in the room, who's in the Zoom room, who's watching on Facebook. But I am aware that all of you watching us may have come from some different backgrounds and may have some different levels of knowledge about the history of the Holy Land in the 20th century. And so for some of you, some of what Ben says, some of what I say may be old hat and you may be very familiar with it. But for some people, it may be new information. So we just wanted to make sure all our bases were covered and we're all working from the same starting point. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ben. And we have some slides, but I'm going to try and share with you. Okay.
Fantastic. Hey, everybody. So I'm Ben, and this is a great honor to be working with Leyla because normally she is completely uninterested in matters of history. So this is definitely a first. I've just put some words on the screen. I'm sure they are words that you all are familiar with. I'm also sure that Leyla would do a much better job of explaining most of them than I, but I just wanted us all to have a familiarity with these terms so that we can wrap our heads around them and realize that they're not the same thing in many cases, although sometimes our media present them as being the same thing. So I started off with anti-Judaism because I think much of what I'm going to say over the next 10 minutes relates to European anti-Judaism, which is a virulent force in the world and was a virulent force through much of European history. And I don't want to in any way diminish how badly Europeans have treated Jews, people who believe in the faith of Judaism, which is why I'm here referring to anti-Judaism. So much of the story of Israel-Palestine, I think, can be traced back to European hatred, prejudice against Jews. And so I just want to say that from the get-go. And I also just want to point out we're talking about anti-Judaism here, not anti-Semitism, although often the word anti-Semitism is used to express this same hatred or prejudice against the Jews. But of course, Palestinians are among the Semitic peoples. So just on a technical point, we can't really talk about anti-Semitism referring only to Jewish people. Palestinians are a people who have lived in an area either side of the Jordan River through an immense expanse of history. I remember when I was at seminary, I was lucky enough to have in my class a Palestinian named Yazid, who would always say that Christian Palestinians have been in the land since time immemorial. He always managed to sound like his grandfather, even when he was a 25-year-old. But anyway, the point being that Palestinians are a people very much associated through time with a particular area of land. Arabs is a much more general term. If we're thinking of geography, we're thinking of people who today inhabit an area stretching from Morocco in the west all the way through Iraq in the east. So we're talking about, therefore, a real huge swathe of land with a huge diversity of peoples in it, right? We're talking about North Africans, we're talking about people we refer to as Middle Eastern, and the different dialects of Arabic that these folks are speaking, the different foods, delicious foods that they eat, just bespeak how different they all are, yet they fall under this category of Arabs. Muslims is a far larger group of people, some 2.2 billion people worldwide identify as practitioners of the faith of Islam, and they're whom we call Muslims. And I just want it on record that not all Palestinians are Muslims, not all Arabs are Muslims. Those three categories are not interchangeable, although often in our media they are. And then finally, Hamas. This is actually an acronym for a group that call themselves the Islamic Resistance Movement. They are a group of militants, but they're also a political party. They began with the political platform of ending the state of Israel, but when they themselves came to govern the area we call Gaza, they actually changed their political platform in order to seek what they described then as a two-state solution. We all know the horrific acts that Hamas undertook on October 7th, and we all know the just blood-chilling phenomenon of the hostage taking, of the murder squads that must have reminded people in Israel of the pogroms in 19th century Europe. But again, Hamas does not represent all Palestinians. And again, we just need to differentiate those categories. Okay, that was the terminology. Now we've got a few maps. Now, if the terminology is contested, the maps are even more contested. So I decided in a bit of inspiration, I think, that the best way to get maps that everyone agree is right is to go to the BBC. Because obviously everyone trusts the BBC. And so all the maps I'm going to show you are from that source. It needs to be pointed out that when the British took colonial control of the area that you see on your map, it was in the aftermath of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Can you minimize that?
No, I don't want to. But...
Yeah.
No, that's it. Right. Thank you. Sorry.
So what you're seeing on your screen is the British mandate that in the aftermath of the First World War, Britain took charge of territory that formerly had been in the Ottoman Empire. But Anglicans, of which I am one, had already been evangelizing the peoples of Palestine and Transjordan, so-called because it's on the other side of the Jordan River, in the 19th century. But of course, like most self-important European evangelists in the 19th century, they arrived thinking that they were bringing Christianity to the people, only to discover that Christianity was already there, because Palestinian Christians were happily living in Palestine and Transjordan under Ottoman rule. In fact, the Ottomans were a very tolerant set of rulers. And so, again, this just emphasizes that Palestinian Christianity is going back through time immemorial. When the British, in the wake of the First World War, became the colonial controllers of this region, they took it upon themselves to establish for Jewish people something of a homeland. This goes back to a Briton by the name of Arthur Balfour, who, out of great sympathy for the sufferings of European Jews, decided that this area could also welcome Jews as some sort of homeland. But even when making this decision, it was determined, as I say on the slide, that any national home for Jewish people did not prejudice the civil and religious rights of the non-Jewish communities who were living there, which is to say the Christian Palestinians, the Muslim Palestinians who already occupied that land. And if this was the case after the First World War, even more was it the case after the Second World War, that Europeans had great sympathy for the sufferings of the Jews in Europe. Obviously, with 6 million of them murdered in the Holocaust, there was this sense that Europeans felt something needed to be done in creating a homeland for the Jews. Is this where you take it, darling?
You have one more.
Oh,
You have one more slide.
fantastic, thank you. But of course, the terrible truth was that there were already people living in this land. It was not a blank slate that the British had it within their power to hand over to a new set of people. But that, of course, didn't stop the British from trying. And so what you find is that the British, in the aftermath of the Second World War, draw back from the Mandate territory, and at that point, the new state of Israel is declared on May the 14th, 1948.
And I'll just pause there to say, remember that date of May 14th, 1948, because that's, I think, where my sort of personal narrative intersects with the global narrative.
The British had been busy arming Israeli militias, and as a result, on that date, some 750,000 Palestinians fled their homes, fled for their lives, fled with what little property they could take with them, but of course left behind their homes, most of their properties, which then in turn came to be occupied by Israelis. The surrounding Arab nations were not happy about this state of affairs, and a war broke out between Israel and the 5 surrounding Arab armies, which ultimately in 1949 ended in armistice. The surrounding states refused to recognize Israel at that stage, But the map that you see is what the armistice lines look like, where you can see the Jordanians, which is what the territory known as Transjordan now became, occupied large amounts of the West Bank, and of course Gaza was occupied by Egypt. This, however, left within the borders of this newly created State of Israel 150,000 Palestinians who had remained. And this was, of course, the basis for the Palestinian-Israeli population, which now numbers some 1.6 million people, and that constitutes 20% of the Israeli population. All right, the boring historian now cedes the room to the exciting biography.
So this is a picture, and it's going to come with some audio in just a minute, and some more pictures of me, my mother, who I believe is watching this, so hi, Mom, and my late grandmother, all of whom are Palestinian. I'm technically half Palestinian. My dad was half Croatian and half Irish. And so I really identify as a Palestinian American. I would say I am white passing. And partly because I am white passing, I didn't really know my ancestry until I was maybe a late teenager. And once I sort of figured out that I was Palestinian and that became really important to my identity, I spent a summer after I graduated college recording my grandmother's stories. I went to her house every day for about 4 or 5 weeks, and just asked her questions and listened to her history. So I want to play you this is the very first few minutes of those tapes, and I hope that the sound is going to come through. And Rachel, you can tell me if it doesn't. I probably should have tried this out beforehand. Can you guys hear that?
No.
Can you hear that, Rachel?
I'm trying to unmute myself and in the.
If not, a big deal.
There were no words at that point.
It was just some sound, background sound. I'll just play it. Look, you can see the pictures even if you can't hear the sound. So I don't know if you guys can hear this audio. It's too faint. Okay. I don't know if you can hear that audio. It sounds like you maybe can't, but you can at least see the pictures. And here's my grandmother and me. Before that, you saw my grandmother and me and my daughter. So we're up to 4 generations of Palestinian women there. But I love this picture because my grandmother is one of the most foundational sources, not only of my sense of identity, but also of my sense of faith. I mean, she and her family are really the main reason why I'm a priest today, because she had such a strong faith, and I'll come back to how I sort of inherited that from her. But my grandmother was born, her name's Bahi, and she was born in Haifa in what was then Palestine, which was part of the British Mandate. And she was born into a neighborhood of Christians within Haifa. But she was always very clear to point out that while there were sort of general vague neighborhoods of Christians and Jews and Muslims, that they all really relied upon each other and trusted each other in order to live life as you do neighbors today in this time, in this place. But even before that, I wanted to point out that my great grandmother, a woman named Zale, her family and my great-grandfather, their family lived in a village not far from Haifa called Shefa'amr, which was about a dozen miles from Haifa, is now also part of Israel. But at the time that my great-grandmother lived was part of the Ottoman Empire. And my great-grandparents, my great-great-grandparents, all of them were Anglican. I actually don't know where the Anglicanism starts in my family because it's at least 4 generations back, and presumably when those Brits first came as Anglican missionaries. So the Anglicanism in my family goes very far back. And I mentioned that, and I also want to point out that my great-grandmother in that small village, Shefa'amr, that village was also made up of a combination of Jews, of Christians, both Catholic and Protestant and Orthodox, of Muslims, of Druze. And I remember this one part in my grandmother's stories where she was really keen to share with me and tell me and remind me that all these people of all these different religions lived together, not only in harmony, but in reliance upon one another. When someone died, everyone in the village went to that funeral, whether it was a Christian funeral or a Muslim funeral or a Jewish funeral. And they all mourned, they all grieved when someone in the village died. When someone was born, they all rejoiced at that birth. When someone was married, they all went to the wedding, whether it was in the church or in the mosque or in the temple, in the synagogue, right? Everyone celebrated and grieved together. They were part of the same community, regardless of religion. And I think that's really important to remember, because we get caught up in thinking that this is a war or a conflict based on religion, and it's not. And I just want to I want to point this out so you can see at the top, at least hopefully you can see at the top, that the word Allah, which you hopefully know is the word for God, it's often thought, some people think that Allah is the Muslim God, and that's not the case. And you can see the Arabic right next to where I've written Allah in English, and you can see I've circled it in this text. And I don't know if there's someone in the room that is unmuted where Rachel is. If you want to guess what this text is, where you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 instances of Allah in the first paragraph and a half of this text. Any guesses?
Is there a taker? Anyone in the chat? Bob?
No,
We got one.
what do we got?
Sure.
This is beginning of Genesis.
Beginning of Genesis is a guess we have.
It is. Well done. A+ for whoever that was. These are the first few verses of the Bible. This is Genesis 1 in the Bible, and you can see that Allah is the word that is used. In the beginning, God created the earth, right? And so I just want to point out again that this is the Arabic word for God. It is not Muslim God, it is not anything else but the Arabic word for God, used by Christians, Muslims, and Jews to refer to God, who speak Arabic, Christians, Muslims, Jews who speak Arabic, to refer to God. So I just want to go back. Oh, there we go. So I'll put those pictures up there again as I continue talking. No, I think that's option. Sorry, I'm gonna put my picture up there still. So let me tell you a little bit about my grandmother's story. My grandmother and grandfather met in Haifa. They sang together in the Anglican church choir at St. John's Anglican Church. And they were married in January of 1948. So if you remember the history that Ben shared, we're talking a couple of months before the state of Israel was created on May 14th in 1948. So they were married January in 1948. They had no pictures of their wedding. They couldn't really invite anyone to their wedding. The postal service was not working by that point. My grandmother struggled to get the items that she needed to be a bride. She had to borrow bouquet, shoes, all that sort of stuff. She managed to get a wedding dress that a seamstress made for her. But other than that, she had to borrow everything that she used in her wedding from women who had gotten married the previous summer before the violence had really taken root. By the time she was married in January of 1948, no one could even get to the church because there was martial law, there were curfews that were happening even during the day. People were being shot at and killed. Nobody really knew what was going on. And there was this sort of constant threat of violence, particularly against the Palestinians who were indigenous to the area. But she did go to the church. She did get married to my grandfather, and they took a short 10-day honeymoon in Egypt before returning to Haifa. And they came back from Egypt on the train when they returned from their honeymoon, but their family couldn't greet them as newlyweds at the train station. They were met instead by British security forces who told them that there was one of these long-term curfews in place and that no one could go outside or walk around even during the day because they would be shot. And so they took them to a quarantine where they separated them. There was one room for men and one room for women, although my grandparents were the only people in this quarantine, but they still separated them. And my grandmother said she was fearful that she would be killed or raped, and she didn't know what was going on. Finally, my grandfather's brother, who worked for the municipality in Haifa, managed to get a fire truck to come and retrieve them from the quarantine. They spent a night separate from each other in the quarantine, and the fire truck retrieved them, and with its sirens blaring, took them to my grandfather's family's home before they were able to move into their new apartment together just up the road from my grandfather's family home. At that point, the confusion just continued. There were always rumors of people being shot. There were explosions in the night. The Zionist militias, who were called militias, but my grandmother really experienced them as terrorists. They would fill barrels with explosives, and then roll the barrels into the Arab neighborhoods in the middle of the night. And there was no accountability of that. There was no protection from that. And there was just this constant threat of violence, this constant curfew, you never knew if you could get out to get bread. Some days there was meat and vegetables, some days there weren't. And this was just the life that they lived. Rumors traveled and swirled from house to house that the Zionist militiamen were breaking into Arab homes, raping women, killing the inhabitants. And the British authorities, who my grandparents had some access to, both because they were Anglican and because my grandfather worked for a British company, a shipping company. And so they had news from British authorities, and the British authorities kept telling them that they weren't safe, that it would be better if they left. And so they finally did. They fled in mid-April of 1948, so about a month before the State of Israel was created. And it was probably good timing for them, because if they had stayed another month, they may have ended up as some of the Palestinians who were forced into these refugee camps, into the Gaza Strip and the other areas. So they fled in April of 1948. They did so under threat. They fled fearing for their lives. They left almost everything behind them except the clothes that they were wearing. My grandmother said she packed a couple of other dresses, and she took all her jewelry and all the cash that they had on hand. And they boarded a cargo ship that was bound for Beirut. And I point out that it was a cargo ship because it was not meant to transport people. It was meant to transport cargo. And there were so many people fleeing at this time that the cargo ship was packed with people. My grandmother said it was cold. It was very frigid. She was 4 months pregnant. She had gotten pregnant on her honeymoon, and she was 4 months pregnant with the child who would become my mother. So she was cold. She was starving. She was very hungry. It was an overnight journey. There was nothing to eat. There was nothing to drink. And they had, in order to fit more people onto this cargo ship, they had sort of created a second floor in the underneath, what do you call that, underneath the ship? The steerage compartment? Anyways, I don't know my ship terminology, but they had sort of used boards to create a second floor underneath the ship. And my grandparents didn't know that. They were on the bottom level and they thought above them was just the ceiling, but it was actually this like half created second floor. And in the during the journey, these boards fell, and they just happened to fall right where my grandparents were sitting underneath them. And a woman fell through the ceiling, and the board landed on my grandfather. It hit him on the head, and the woman sort of landed on top of him, and it knocked him out cold. And there was my grandmother, newlywed, newly pregnant, 20 years old, and she thought her new husband had died. Like, she was convinced that he was killed. She didn't know anyone on the ship. She didn't know who to talk to. She didn't know who to turn to for help. She had a sister in Beirut who was already married. So she knew someone in Beirut, but she didn't know her sister's phone number. She didn't know the address where they lived. She had just been relying on her husband for all of these things. And so in that moment, when my grandfather was hit and she thought he was dead, she said it was the scariest moment of her entire life. And in that moment, she prayed to God and she said, God, help me and fix this situation. And she didn't know what else to do. And so that's what she fell back on. I guess a few minutes later, I don't know how long it was, my grandfather came to, and they continued on their journey, and landed in Beirut, and eventually found an apartment that my mother was born into and brought home into. They always thought, when they left, they thought they would go back. They thought they would be going back in a couple of weeks' time. They thought that the violence would settle down and that they would be able to go back home. And they never were. My grandparents, when they left Haifa, they were never allowed to go back. And their story went on from there. It eventually landed them here in the United States, where I was born, but they were never allowed to go back. They were forced out of their home, and that was the end of the story. And there was no recompense for that. There was no opportunity. There was no acknowledgement of what happened to them. Yeah, so that is sort of how my family's story fits into the history of what Ben told you. And we paused there because May 14th, 1948, which is the creation of Israel, is known in Palestine and in the Arab world as the Nakba, the catastrophe, the disaster, because while it may have been the creation of the state of Israel for European Jews and Zionists, it was a catastrophe, a disaster for the indigenous Palestinians living there already. The history goes on, however, and so I'm going to let Ben take over from there and continue with where the history goes.
Not too much more history, don't worry. So fast forward to 1967, and the Six-Day War breaks out. This is a war in which Syria, Jordan, and Egypt attack Israel, but Israel's shrewd military know-how enables a lightning quick victory over its Arab neighbors. And in this war, the state of Israel takes some territory that previously was belonging to these Arab nations. So you can see at the top of the map, the Golan Heights are seized from Syria. At the bottom near Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula is Gaza. And then the area around Jerusalem that used to be under the control of Jordan now becomes under the control of the State of Israel as the West Bank. And these are what today are called the occupied territories. And of course, the extraordinary truth about this war is that the seizure of these territories by the State of Israel was condemned by the United Nations. And this, the pre-1967 borders, which is to say, before the Six-Day War and the State of Israel's taking over of these territories, the pre-1967 borders are still something you might hear of today. They're something that the Palestinians want to go back to. They're something that the international community wanted to go back to. And so this resolution 242 of the United Nations Security Council, which was adopted unanimously, including by the US, let's see what it said. It called for the withdrawal of Israeli troops from the occupied territories. It acknowledged the claim of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of every state in the region. And it requested the UN Secretary General to appoint an envoy to facilitate an acceptable solution to the conflict. So, at least from the perspective of the United Nations, to this day, Israel is illegally occupying territory that it should not. Now, we all know that US foreign policy has shifted a good deal since 1967, but this is still a resolution that stands. So let's bring the story up to today. Here we have my most colorful map. I don't know if you can see the real key on this map is the green patches, which are Israeli settlements. Really from the 1960s onwards, the narrative that you may have heard that these lands belong by divine right to the Jewish people starts to be a story that's told. Interestingly, it's not told by the Zionist movement of the late part of the 19th century and the early 20th century. So this reference to the scriptural lands is something that only really from the 1960s gets used, and of course is given great support by evangelical Christians in the United States, who like talking about the biblical lands as those belonging to the Jews. So these settlements are once again illegal in that they are taking place in areas that before 1967 were off limits to Israelis. And you can start to see from the map how these have expanded up through today. What the map can't show you, and maybe what I should have had some photos of, is that these settlements are not little tent cities. These are now towns with electricity and water supplied by the Israeli state. They are therefore not something that can easily go away. And this seems to have been a policy on the part of the State of Israel, actually to build up these settlements rather than abide by international law. And of course, I think it's worth saying that no politician necessarily represents the people. No government necessarily represents all of the people. And of course, in Israel, that seems to be particularly true at the moment, when the Netanyahu government, right up until the horrific attacks by Hamas, were deeply unpopular with the Israeli people. There were demonstrations on the streets trying to overthrow the Netanyahu regime. But the reason I bring the Netanyahu government to this slide is because some of the most hardline members of the Netanyahu government actually grew up as settlers. Because of the sort of swing to the extreme right that Netanyahu has taken, there are at least two members of the government who are just hell-bent on the destruction of Palestinians, and one of the means by which Smotrich and Ben Gvir want to do this is by empowering the settlers. I'm going to end here. The thing I just want you all to know is that there is no easy way out of this current impasse. And so any political settlement is going to be a very difficult thing to construct.
Yeah, I mean, other than Israelis leaving these areas, which, as Ben points out, it's going to be hard to do because they have built them up so much.
Yeah.
This is my favorite slide. So you can see 3 generations of Palestinian Christian women plus 2 beloved white dudes. So I like this slide. I just wanted to put this slide up here as I share with you that, my grandmother's story, my family's story has, as I said at the beginning, really shaped my identity, but also my faith. I once, here's a little bit of biology to add to your history. I once learned that a baby girl in utero has all of her eggs inside of that body when she's still in her mother's womb. And so I sort of like to think of myself, or at least half myself, as like a Russian doll, inside my mother's womb as she was a baby inside of my grandmother's womb. In that moment when the board fell on my grandfather and my grandmother sort of fell back on this faith that she had. So all the fear of that moment, but also all the faith of that moment is something that I sort of inherited in my very DNA. And I also want to point out that my grandmother was one of 9 siblings, and 7 of those siblings lived within about a 15-minute radius of my house when I was growing up. And I saw my extended family on a weekly, if not more, basis. And we would all gather at one of my great aunt's houses or my grandmother's house, and my great uncle would take a piece of pita bread and break it and start passing it along the table, among all the aunts and uncles and cousins that were all gathered there. And it was only later in life that I realized how symbolic of the Eucharistic feast that was, and the fact that that happened on Sunday afternoons after we had all been at church. There was this real wonderful resonance of that happening, first in the Eucharistic feast in the church, and then at the Eucharistic feast that was happening at my family's table. But I realized that not everyone is lucky enough to have a Palestinian grandmother. So what can you learn from all of this? So I want to give you some takeaways about Palestinian Christians, and I am aware of the time, so I'm going to try and make this as quick as possible. But here's what I hope the Palestinian Christian story, how I hope the Palestinian Christian story will shape you. So first of all, know that we exist. Know that Palestinian Christians exist. We exist in Gaza. We exist in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, in Israel proper, in the diaspora throughout the world, including in the US, and in the Anglican Communion, and right here in the Episcopal Church. So if you are an Episcopalian, if you are a Christian, when things are happening in the Holy Land that you don't understand or that you find scary or confusing, I hope you will turn to us, to your Palestinian Christian brothers and sisters first. I hope that you will prioritize our voice because we are your siblings in Christ. So I hope you will prioritize our voice. At the very least, I hope you will not silence it or seek to silence it. So first, know that Palestinian Christians exist. Second, recognize that Palestinian Christians have a unique understanding of the cultural context of Jesus. And again, I'm speaking now mostly to Christians, and I don't know if everyone listening is Christians, but this is for Christians to take away about Palestinian Christians. Please recognize that Palestinian Christians, particularly Palestinian Christians who are still in Palestine, but really all Palestinian Christians have a unique understanding of Jesus's culture. It may not be the same time period that Jesus lived in, but it's the same area, the same culture that Jesus lived in. And I hope you will recognize that. Honor the fact that Palestinian Christians have a deep respect and understanding for Jewish and Muslim traditions because we share a culture with them. So we share a linguistic ancestry. We are of the same race. We are all Semitic. And so being a Palestinian Christian cannot be anti-Semitic, right? Being a Palestinian Christian does not make us anti-Jewish. And when Palestinian Christians tell their story of victimization, I hope you will listen to it without immediately accusing us of being anti-Jewish or being anti-Semitic, which doesn't even make sense because we are Semitic. And then acknowledge, that leads into this next one, acknowledge the fact that Palestinian Christians are Palestinians and that they are treated as such by the nation state of Israel, both in recent history and right now. Palestinian Christians live under apartheid. They live under apartheid. They live under oppression. They have been and continue to be forced out of their homes. They are kept in open air prisons. They are bombed. They are harassed. They are beaten. They are killed by Israeli settlers on their own land and by IDF soldiers. That is the reality of Palestinian Christians, both in recent history and today. Palestinian Christians have been and are being persecuted. And if you don't believe me when I say that, I ask you to listen to Palestinian Christians on the ground. And the best way and the easiest way to do that is to take a look at the Kairos Palestine document, which was published in 2009. There's the website right there. It's just www.kairospalestine.ps. And it was a document published by the patriarchs. They're all patriarchs because they're all men, but the Christian patriarchs of the Holy Land at that time. And you can see them listed on the right there. And it is their word to other Christians throughout the world. You can see the introduction, a group of Christian Palestinians cry out from within the suffering in our country under the Israeli occupation with a cry of hope in the absence of all hope, a cry full of prayer and faith and a God ever vigilant. So I really, really encourage you to take a look at the Kairos Palestine document. At the bottom of this slide, you can see that the Presbyterian Church USA has an amazing study guide to go along with the Kairos Palestine document, and it's a really easy way to hear the voice of Palestinian Christians and to really dive deep into their experience. So I know we said that we were going to leave time for questions, and I have not done a very good job of that, but maybe there are some people who can stay on.
I just want to say thank you so much. Oh, someone brought my video onto the screen. Wonderful. Thank you so much. It is getting on noon, so I know some folks might need to go off to other meetings, but we do have the room. And I think the Kings have time for us for some questions, if that's okay. So either from the room or if there's questions from the chat or the live stream, please feel free to open it up. And we do have some members of our Muslim student community as well in the classroom. So
sorry to the Muslims that it was very Christian focused, but
so how can we I will make sure that I will give the I will share the video file. Someone asked in the chat how we can get a link to the recording. I'll share a video file with Leyla as well, and I will put it on the Harcourt Parish YouTube channel as well. So Yes, it will be on, it will be shared around, but I will post it hopefully later today, even on the Harcourt Parish Episcopal Church YouTube channel. Yeah, any other questions or comments? Oh, you put one in the chat, Noah? Okay. We have one coming. So there. So I don't know if you can see that. One of the key reasons that Israel is able to continue its oppressive apartheid regime is the full unconditional support of the USA. What do you think? And I will add to that as well, and I think they address this in the talk, American Christians, yes, right? Specifically American Christians. So what do you feel like we can do to combat that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I also see Christine's question earlier that what do you see happening to resolve the situation in Gaza? And we can try and address that. I don't know that we are equipped to address that, but we'll start with Noah's question. I mean, part of the reason why, I think the main reason why we are here and we are doing this is because Rachel and I think Rachel reached out to me, and I'm really committed to education. I think the number one way we can change things is through education, through telling this story, through telling our stories. It's very different if you go out and say, you know, Palestinians are living under apartheid situation and Israel is oppressive. You know, maybe you get called anti-Semitic, maybe you get silenced, but it's sort of different when you say, this is what happened to my grandmother, right? This is what happened to my father. This is what happened to my brother. This is what happened to my cousin. This is what happened to my friend who's living right now in Gaza, right? And that's why some of these like Instagram people, I don't, what do you call someone who posts on Instagram? But you know, these people who are on the ground and sharing their stories in real time, I think are so powerful and so profound. So I really think doing the education, helping people understand that Palestinian Christians exist, that we are here in the States, that we're here across the globe, that we're here in Palestine proper, that's going to be a big piece of it. And you all, whether or not you're Palestinian, can be part of that education too. You know, take this story with you, go to the rallies. That's great. Please do that. But also like, just talk to your friends, engage people in relationship and say, I heard this story and I want to share it with you.
Thank you.
The only thing that I would say is somehow there's got to be a way of explaining to the US government that it doesn't make sense to, on the one hand, be giving $3.8 billion per annum of funding for Israel's military hardware, and at the same time asking for humanitarian pauses because it's the American hardware that's being used to destroy Gaza. And it's presumably going to be the international community that's going to have to rebuild Gaza, and that's going to cost billions of dollars. And there's just a disconnect there, and I don't know what the solution is. I'm just a humble church historian, but that just doesn't make sense. None of that makes sense.
Any other comments or questions? I personally know a few Palestinian Christian Episcopalians, some living in Israel, some in the US. What do you think is the most effective way to help our local, state, and US government and UN stop the genocide? Maybe that just got answered. Yeah, I think that's what we, you know, the education piece as well. I want to, I'll highlight as well the Kairos document. And I can't remember whether we had talked about this or not. But there was actually another document put out by Kairos Palestine just in the last week, perhaps, a joint statement from Kairos Palestine and Kairos South Africa, really calling particularly churches in the West to repentance, honestly, for silence and for the failure to listen to our siblings in Palestine. So I think it's just incredibly important. for churches to be engaged in this conversation.
I'm sorry that Ben just had to leave, but we just got a call from our middle schooler who never
Oh,
called
no.
us during the middle of the day. So he's just going to
Okay.
figure out what's going on there.
Life of clergy parenting. But thank you. So in the absence of any other questions or comments, I will say thank you yet
Yeah,
again, and I will stop the live stream and I will stop the recording, but I assume you can stay on the call for a minute if anyone has any
yeah.
less formal
Certainly.
questions or conversations. So thank you again.
Thanks, y'all.